ladies and gentlemen, to this first session. This is going to be an interesting session for many of us. For me personally, I found these two books by Anna and Norman very, very interesting. We in India are going through a period of our lives where I think history holds out many lessons. It's up to us what we make of those. Later generations will tell us that we were witness to many changes, and what we do with those changes, whether we choose to learn from them, whether we choose to resist them, whether we choose to go along with them, I think future generations will decide for us. I'm going to start with you, Anna. As you know, we have had a major human tragedy that took place in the subcontinent that has affected us in many, many ways, the partition of 1947. 70 years down the road, it continues to haunt us, trouble us, its consequences unspooled from us, in front of our eyes. And there was much in the partition of 1947, like the events that you have described in our book, in your book, that have given much fodder to the historian, the literary historian, the sociologist, the creative writer, the novelist, the poet. You have written about a very important period in the history of Europe, the First World War, the years between the wars, the rise of fascist forces, the rise of Hitler's Germany. But you have chosen to write it in the form of a novel. And your first much acclaimed book was actually nonfiction. Tell us about this move from nonfiction to novel and why you chose to write about historical figures, people who existed. The main characters of your book were real people. They existed in a time and place. But you have located them in a sort of a fictional account. I'm going to read the first line of Anna's book, which says, "When Hitler came to power, I was in the bath." And Ruth, the narrator, her husband, is crushing limes to make mojitos. And that's how the book starts. So there are these little details of ordinary everyday life which are woven to create a story which is actually grounded in fact. Tell us a little about that.
That's the most magnificent long introduction.
Sorry about that. I shall keep quiet henceforth and keep my questions really short.
I'd like to say first how grateful I am to be here, to the festival and to the Australian Embassy. The partition of India you mentioned is really more relevant probably to my first book, which is about the partition of Germany. And as you say, that was, I think I'm ringing, a non-fiction book about the resistance among ordinary people to the Stasi regime in East Germany, when Germany was divided into a communist region in the east and a western part in the west. And I'm fairly ignorant about partition here, but I think that the kinds of human stories that very violent politics like that throw up can illuminate in a way what it is to be human. And I was interested in what makes some people refuse to go along with a very inequitable system. And I think that was my interest really in Stasiland, where there were 4 people who refused to cooperate with the secret police, the Stasi, and inform on their friends and family and colleagues. And in all that I am, I took resistors to the Hitler regime, also real people. So I think I don't want to ever really examine my own psychology too closely, but there's obviously something about resistance to authority that is interesting to me. And the other part of your question, I guess, is about choosing to write non-fiction or fiction. With Stasiland, I was writing in the 90s. I started thinking about that book not long after the Berlin Wall fell. And I found, almost accidentally, stories of really extraordinary bravery. For instance, Miriam, who was a 16-year-old in 1968 and she protested against the Stasi regime, and then she was put in custody in prison and released to await her trial. And she went up to Berlin on a train on her own on New Year's Eve, 1968, and tried to climb, and very nearly did make it across the Berlin Wall. So when I found that story, I thought, I can write a novel out of this story. But then I realized I was living, perhaps as you are now, I was living in Berlin then, in a place where the former Stasi and their former victims, or people I'd like to think of as kind of heroic, might meet in the supermarket queue. You know, Miriam might be behind her former interrogator waiting to buy cheese. And I just thought, it's not up to me at this point in history to make fiction out of something that needs to be told from their point of view as a true story. And just briefly, I would add to that there were a lot of things about the world in the Stasi regime that were unbelievable. And if I put them in a novel, I would have lost credibility of the reader quite quickly. For instance, one of the Stasi methods of surveying someone was to break into their house when they were out, steal a piece of their dirty underwear, bottle it in a jar, label it with your name and say, you know, Anna Funder underwear, and train a dog to follow you by your scent. And I just felt there were many, many, many details like that about the insidiousness of the regime, and I felt that I would have lost credibility very quickly. I wouldn't have been able to make a believable world in a novel with that kind of detail. And you can't bear witness in a novel in the same way as you possibly can in nonfiction. I will talk about the novel in maybe next question.
All right. Let us get you to talk about the novel, because possibly many people here have not read it. But I'd also like you to briefly talk about the novel and bring in issues that really are the subtext. Issues such as moral courage. You've talked of resistance, but you also have very strong women characters. Let's talk a little about feminism and how you understand this here. Let's also talk a little about something that seems very interesting to me. You talk of rational articulation as a way of countering what is happening. So can rational human beings articulate and be a counterpower to the kind of fascism that you describe in your novel?
Just briefly on the novel, which is called All That I Am, is the story of essentially two couples, young people who were involved in a left-wing party in the late 20s and early 30s in Germany. And when Hitler came to power, these were educated, sophisticated journalists and politicians and activists. They had to flee to London, and without giving too much away, that was in 1933, and in 1935, excuse me, two of the characters in the book, and this really happened, were found poisoned they had the top floor flat in a building in Bloomsbury, and they were found poisoned in bed together. One, Mathilde Wurm, a woman of 60 who was a politician, clothed, and her flatmate Dora Fabian, who was 33, in her pyjamas, dead, poisoned in bed. With the room was locked, there was no sign of forced entry, and the bedclothes were pulled up to their chins and tucked in neatly. And I have to say, it was the tucking in neatly that most enraged me when I found this out in a historian's book. And I thought, no one who commits suicide will tuck themselves in neatly. And the British authorities did a very cursory investigation of this. It was a time of high appeasement, so the British wanted to placate Hitler and be friends with Hitler, and they effectively covered up this political assassination. So I looked into it very closely, And a friend of mine, an old woman who had taught my German teacher in Australia German, had been a very good friend of Dora Fabian's, one of these dead women. So I knew a bit about this from a real person, and then I went and found out what I could. But it had to be a novel because there was actually no way for me to really know what happened in that closed room. So I had to invent it on the best available evidence. And in the novel, not that it matters to anyone who reads it, but I used only real facts that a coroner might have looked at had it been investigated better. And it seemed to me that this was a political assassination, like Putin is doing now, like Litvinenko. I don't know whether there are other more local examples of that, of political assassinations of people who were speaking out against a particular government.
A certain judge was found dead, and it's causing outrage in certain sections of society today in India.
Really?
Yes. Please do carry on.
No. That's fascinating. So just to finish up, because I've talked so much. My real interest is in, it seems very counterintuitive that human beings would be so brave, like the ordinary people, the student, the housewife, the alcoholic rock star in Stasiland, or these people in All That I Am. When you know it might go very, very badly for you, where is it that the courage comes from to speak out? And I think that issue is live across the world in many, many places, including here now. And it strikes me as a kind of very extraordinary anti-Darwinian thing about human beings. And I'm just endlessly curious about it.
Thank you. And I will come back to your book, but Norman, I found your book very, very astonishing. I mean, I was aware of drugs being available in Germany, but I was certainly not aware of the cartel that you have described and the big pharmaceutical giants that we all know in India, Bayer, Merck, and so on, and how, but let me not give those details. Could you start a little by telling us about the existence of drugs in Germany before you come to your book, which actually makes this remarkable sort of link between the extensive drug use and the actions not just of Hitler, but many of his other frontline leaders. But do talk a little about the years leading up to Hitler.
Well, I think it all starts in 1805 when a young chemist in Germany discovers the alkaloid in opium, and he basically discovers morphine, and from that is in a way the beginning of the pharmaceutical industry as we know today. And very quickly in Germany, chemists' shops that previously had a little garden and use plants to make medicines are now manufacturing more and more high quality medicines. And it takes a couple of decades until the late 19th century when a chemist working for the Bayer company develops two drugs within the span of 1 week. One is aspirin and one is heroin. And he goes to his bosses and presents these new inventions, and probably he got a raise, but for sure it kind of boosted the Bayer company. They didn't know in the beginning which would be the more successful drug, which just shows you that in the beginning, when new drugs are being developed, we don't really know if it's a drug, is it a medicine? So Bayer was actually promoting heroin. There's numerous ads that they made for heroin. They suggested it should be used as a sleeping aid for babies even, which sounds totally crazy, but probably it worked in a way. So they didn't understand the addictive quality yet. So, and this is very typical of the 19th century, the early 20th century, when most of these highly dangerous illegal drugs we know today were in fact legal German products. The German pharmaceutical industry and the German economy as a whole made a lot of money with these drugs. That's why they were very reluctant to sign that part of the Versailles Treaty after they lost the First World War, because the Versailles Treaty in a way was the first implemented the first anti-drug policies. So Germany was, that's why I call it in Blitzed, I call it the land of drugs. It was a big drug inventing country, and then the Nazis come.
and then the Nazis come. But before that, talk a little also, I found that personally very fascinating, between the war years, you know. You talk of Berlin being virtually the drug capital of the world, the cartels that are operating, which are providing drugs to different corners of the world. You talk of course, the pharmaceutical companies that you've mentioned. But you also talk of the falling mark, you know, and as the currency collapses. You talk a little about also the deteriorating moral values. Would you like to talk about that?
Well, when Germany lost the First World War in 1918, the first democracy on German soil was installed, the so-called Weimar Republic. It lasted from 1918 to 1933, and it was a time of, it was a fairly free time, a time also of experimentation. Drug use was not stigmatized. Many artists were taking drugs in order to enhance their creativity. Many people were addicted to morphine still from the First World War. Men had been wounded, so morphine was everywhere in the Weimar Republic. So it was, tourists from all over Europe came to Berlin to buy drugs, to have parties. So this is one aspect of the 20s. But there's also another aspect of the 20s, which is large corporations gain more and more power. In fact, the pharmaceutical companies created a cartel called the IG Farben, which combined the biggest pharmaceutical companies of Germany into one huge cartel. Big business was starting to have secret meetings with Hitler in the late 20s because they thought he's their man to fight off communism, which was a danger within, as they thought it was a danger coming from within Germany because the Communist Party was strong, but also coming obviously from the Soviet Union. So in a way, democracy already loses its stance towards fascism, which basically fascism, as Mussolini described it, fascism is corporatism. It is when big companies have a too powerful influence on the government. So this destabilized more and more the Weimar Republic and led to January 30th, 1933, when big business had its way and Hitler became appointed as chancellor, and then fascism could really thrive in Germany.
And then comes Pervitin, the people's drug. And I was fascinated to see the ads and his description of how even housewives are, there's an ad that shows a housewife taking a box of chocolates which has been pumped with these drugs. And so she will work better. So this notion of feeling good, of feeling better about oneself, and how widespread this notion is through propaganda, through advertisements, through plain ads that are being put at the back of buses, and how easily available these drugs are. Tell us a little about Pervitin.
Well, it's the big irony of the story is when the Nazis take power in 1933, they present themselves as a clean-cut movement that is going to rid Germany of all the poisons. So they have a very strict anti-drug policy. They, in fact, combine their anti-drug policy with anti-Semitic policy.
Absolutely.
They say in the Weimar Republic, the Jews were promoting drug use, all the doctors were being morphine addicts. So we are putting a stop to that, and we're creating a clean society. But then, after the Olympic Games in Berlin 1936, a company in Berlin called Temmler develops a new medicine they call Pervitin, and the ingredient is nothing but methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is today known as crystal meth. It's a very dangerous drug. But in Germany, methamphetamine was not seen as a drug. And
do show this ad if people
I don't
can
know if you
possibly
can
see it.
But
So the picture shows a woman taking a chocolate.
When Pervitin came onto the market, it became extremely popular because at the time, for example, coffee was hard to buy in Germany, and in a modern performance-driven society, just like in a society we live in today, people crave to be on top of their game. They don't want to be tired in the morning when they go into work or to a podium discussion or to a business meeting. So usually what we do is we drink chai or coffee, but in Germany they took methamphetamine because it was much stronger, much cheaper, and also it was not stigmatized, and it became very popular. In 1938 it came onto the market, and these chocolates that I've been holding up came onto the market. Each little chocolate contained 13 milligrams of pure methamphetamine, which is an incredible dosage. And the German housewives, I mean, Hitler's policy also, he wanted women to stay in the home. They shouldn't be part of the workforce, so they at least could get methamphetamine-laced chocolates when they were cleaning their home. That's why she's smiling. But obviously it shows you how government policies towards drugs are a very important, can be a very important political tool that needs examination and research and understanding.
Yes. Anna, in your novel, you also have a couple of characters who seem to sort of self-medicating and injecting themselves. Do your paths converge at any point, the kind of things that Norman is talking about in his book? Is this something that you came across in your research?
No, it's not. It's new to me. But you asked me a question about feminism earlier. Dora Fabian, who is this firebrand young woman whose father was the Minister of Justice in the Weimar Republic out of Berlin. She was a brilliant student and a radical feminist for the time. And she's this main character who is found poisoned with veronal. And veronal was a very communal garden sleeping tablet. Yeah. But if you had, it was in a kind of sachet, and if you had too many grains, it could be fatal. And that's what the women were poisoned with. But she said all these fantastic feminist things in the 20s that seem even radical today. Yeah. Like that in the left-wing movements in Germany in the early 20th century, as now, I think, in some places, there's a debate between feminism and socialism, as it were. And some people were saying then, particularly the men, when everybody is equal, the women will be equal as well. So we don't need a feminist movement, really, because it's going to even itself out. And Dora Fabian was extraordinarily brilliant, and she just said, that will never happen. As long as women are responsible for their antimacassars, so the cushions in the home, meaning for the housework and the domestic work, women will never be equal. We need a feminist movement. And she was a really radical feminist. She was very fond of men, I have to say. That was very fun to research, and had a lot of lovers, one of whom was Ernst Toller. So Ernst Toller was an extremely famous playwright in Germany, probably second only to Brecht, and Dora Fabian was his inspiration, muse, and secretary. Extremely overqualified for that. But what I found to connect it, I guess, with Norman's work was that I think she had had an abortion quite early on in her life and had after that become addicted to morphine, yes, which was quite readily available. She wasn't addicted in a debilitating way, and I had to be quite careful how I represented that in the book, because I didn't want to write a book about a drug addict. I wanted to write a book about an extraordinary political activist who occasionally took a shot of morphine. So that's what I did, just to combine feminism and drugs with this. Yeah.
Norman, your book is clearly about a drug addict. You make no bones about it. In fact, you call Hitler the super junkie. So tell us how this happens. Tell us, I found this very interesting, the character of the physician, Dr. Morel, whom you describe as a fat man in a grey gabardine suit. He's almost comical, a little ludicrous, puffing and panting, but nevertheless injecting Hitler with all kinds of things. And it starts with fairly innocuous things such as glucose and vitamins which are the new super drug of the 30s. And if I'm not mistaken, Morel is his physician for close to 15 years. Is that right?
Yes. The story is actually quite crazy, and I found it very crazy when I started the research, because I grew up thinking, as anyone in Germany, still believing that part of the Hitler propaganda that was obviously originated while Hitler was in power, that Hitler is this abstinent person. That was a very important part of the Hitler propaganda, to show him as someone who does not drink alcohol, who of course doesn't take drugs, that was not even discussed, someone who doesn't smoke, vegetarian, which was unusual at the time in Germany, Hitler didn't drink coffee, he didn't drink tea. He was like shown as this health saint, basically, that was just working for the German people. And when I discussed with my grandfather, I was a teenager in the 80s, he would still tell me these stories that, you know, Hitler was an orderly man. Maybe he did things wrong, but he was a good character. So it was very interesting for me to read the notes of a certain person called Theo Morell. He became the personal physician of Hitler in 1936. They had a mutual friend, the photographer of Hitler, Hoffmann. He was a patient of Morell. Morell was a sort of celebrity doctor in Berlin in the early 30s. He was one of the first so-called Dr. Feelgoods. So you didn't go to Morell when you had a serious disease, but you went to Morell when you wanted to feel better about your life, or if you had, many actresses went to him, if they had a performance in the evening, they went to Morell in the afternoon, they got a nice shot of stimulating substances that made them confident and happy. And Hoffmann thought this might be good for Hitler as well. So Hitler and Morell met in 1936. They had a dinner together. And Hitler was complaining of stomach problems. He always had stomach problems that his doctors couldn't cure. And Morell gave him his first injection, and Hitler felt really good immediately. It's not recorded what was in that first injection, but what is recorded is by Morell himself, what he injected from 1936 till April 1945, when Hitler, a few days before he committed suicide, fired Morell. So to read these notes by Morell, and they are very detailed, and there's quite a lot of them. He describes waking up Hitler at 11:30, giving him the first injection, discussing what was happening on that day, trying to figure out how to work with the medication throughout that day. Then what will he receive at midnight, and what will he receive at 6 in the morning, because that's how long Hitler was awake, always till 6 in the morning. Then he would get a heavy Veronal, for example, a sleeping pill, or barbiturate. Then he would sleep like a dead man until 11:30 when he was woken up again. So reading these notes show a completely different picture of Hitler, and especially how the medication changed as the war went on, and as the war got more and more difficult is quite interesting. For example, as you said, from 1936 up until August 1941, he receives mostly vitamins, because that was what Morell was famous for. He was the first doctor to realize it's healthy to have vitamins in the body. So he would inject them in high dosages, which is a bit crazy, but still maybe not unhealthy. So Hitler actually boasted. He said, "Now I'm really healthy. Every day I get my vitamin C injection and my glucose injection and vitamin B1." And but then in 1941, for the first time, he gets ill. And this is during a crucial phase in the war against the Soviet Union, when his generals want to move towards Moscow, but he wants to divide the troops and go to Leningrad and to the south to get the oil from the Caucasus. So there was a big fight within the Supreme Command, and he actually has a very heavy flu, cannot go to the military briefing, and he asked Morell, "Give me something stronger than just vitamins. I have to get up. I have to be the Führer." He had big problems letting other people make decisions, being a totalitarian dictator. And in August 1941, he receives an opioid for the first time, Dolantin, another German product, perfectly legal product, but very strong product. It's an opioid that makes you euphoric. His flu was gone within a few seconds. He could go to the briefing room and, give the orders as he was used to giving them. And from that moment on, his medication changes. More and more opioids come into his daily cocktail. He actually receives 1 to 2 injections a day, which over the course of 9 years is a crazy amount. There are notes by Morell in 1944 saying, "Mein Führer, we have to take a break with all these injections. I can't even find a spot anymore in your veins to put the needle in, because all the veins are crusted." And so it gets very intense. And from 1943 on, a new drug even comes into the picture. It's called Eukodal, fabricated by the Merck company in Germany. Its active ingredient is what is known today as oxycodone. It's still being marketed all over the world. There's a huge opioid epidemic in the United States at the moment. President Trump said we have to fight the opioid epidemic because this is oxycodone. This is actually what Hitler took. In America, people take capsules. Hitler got 20 milligrams of it injected into his veins, which creates an extremely powerful euphoria. And at the same time, it gathers all your mental strength, so you kind of feel like on top of the world, and you can easily talk down all your generals that come from the Eastern Front telling you we have to change tactics, we're losing. Hitler always knew better, being on this artificial high. So it's interesting to look at how he uses artificial stimuli towards the end of the war, when the war goes very bad for him and for Germany, in order to be able to stay on track and convince his generals to stay on track with him, because the final victory, of course, would be one which had nothing to do anymore with the situation outside of his drug-induced world. So this is actually a more accurate Hitler biography in a way that
yes.
you can come up with if you study what's going on between Morell and Hitler.
Yeah. Tell us also about the last few days in the bunker. His teeth are rotten, he's got ticks all over, his brain is completely addled. Could you describe Hitler in the last few days, the mental deterioration coupled with the complete physical decay?
Well, I mean, Oikodal has very when you take a shot of 20 milligrams of Oikodal, it has very beautiful, powerful effect on you, but obviously it makes you addicted to it. The next day you need the drug again. If you don't have it, your body will have withdrawal symptoms. After 2 weeks of regularly taking it, which he did, you become physically dependent on it. So the problem for Morell was when they have to move into the bunker in 1945, when the Russians are approaching and they are down in the bunker in Berlin, and at the same time, the Merck company that is producing Oikodal, the drug that Hitler craved, had been bombed and completely destroyed by the Royal Air Force in December 1944. So Morell is running out of the drug that Hitler had become dependent on, and he writes in his notes how desperately he is sending out. He had 2 aides which had motorcycles, and they drive through bombed out Berlin, going from pharmacy to pharmacy. They actually had to have the prescriptions, giving them to the pharmacists. I mean, it still worked like that. There's many reports of the pharmacists kind of writing back, do you really need so many narcotics? Are they for the Führer? I mean, it was all, they tried to keep it in secrecy, but it was a really crazy thing that was going on. So in early 1945, they don't find Oikodal anymore. Hitler gets more and more agitated, ill-mannered. He physically feels really bad. I mean, he's losing Second World War. That's alone a reason to feel really bad. But at the same time, he has this, he's going on cold turkey, basically. Yeah. Yeah. Morell's looking in his doctor's bag, what can I give the Führer to keep him happy? But it's more and more difficult because you cannot really replace Oikodal. He's trying to give him different things. Hitler is not happy. So the relationship between the two people sour, because there's one mistake the dealer should never make, is to make the client dependent on something, then run out of supplies. This is exactly what happened to Morell. So he's fired with the words, Hitler yells at him, you've been giving me opiates the whole time, get the hell out of the bunker. This is in late April 1945. Morell leaves, and Hitler only has, I think, 3 or 4 more days, and then he shoots himself.
Yeah. I have just one last question, and then we'll open it to the audience. Let's talk about moral authority, because I think that links the 2 books, at least to my mind. Are you suggesting, Norman, somewhere in the book, that the drugs take away from the decisions just because his mind is addled with this very toxic chemical cocktail? Do you attribute that to his actions?
Not really. His actions are not, they don't originate from a drug-induced state. They actually originate from the 20s, when Hitler writes his shameful book, Mein Kampf, which is actually on sale in India and by street vendors, which was a big surprise to me, because in Germany we think this is a terrible,
book.
racist book that should not be handed out to people without some kind of guidance or something. So, but anyhow, in that Mein Kampf, that's where the crimes are already kind of laid out. And in the beginning of his of him being chancellor, all the plans for the war and for the genocide against the Jews and Sinti and Roma, the Gypsies, are being formulated. So when he takes drugs later on, that doesn't, he's already that evil person.
Yes.
The drugs don't make him evil. The drugs kind of help him sustain his racist ideology. So the drugs are not responsible, but if we look at the drugs, we understand better how the system actually worked and functioned.
Some of the really bad, tactically bad decisions towards the end, are they attributed to the drugs?
Well, as you might know, on July 20th, 1944, there's a bomb attack against him in the headquarters. It's called Operation Valkyrie. An officer explodes a bomb and Hitler is severely injured. A new doctor, this is what you don't know, but you could know if you read Blitzed, a new doctor comes into the headquarters and gives him cocaine, so another drug comes into play, and he takes a lot of cocaine until the October 1944, and on a very strong cocaine high, he decides to go into the offensive again in the West, which is called the Battle of the Bulge. So he decides on this euphoria that, well, I guess I can't defeat the Russians now, so he withdraws the troops from the Eastern Front, opening up Berlin for the Russians to invade, so it was a totally stupid decision, and moves the troops to the West because he thinks the Americans, they're like, they can't take a hard-fighting German soldiers. We're going to beat the Americans in the West, form a peace treaty with the West, and then go against the Russians. So this is kind of a drug craze. This comes out of a cocaine euphoria, and it's certainly a decision that did not help the German war effort. And a little note on the side, the British historian Anthony Beevor told me that the British intelligence had an assassination plan for Hitler, which they dropped in 1944 because they realized his decision-making is so bad for the German war effort, it's better to leave him in place.
Anna, one last question, taking on this business of moral authority. In your novel, are you saying that the conscience of a handful of people kind of makes up or is some sort of stand against the silence of the majority?
No, I don't think it makes up for the silence of the majority, but I'm interested in honouring the people who were brave enough to do what they did, and not being silent about it after the fact. And I think a good example of that is perhaps to do with Stasiland, my first book, where I was interested in people who were resisting the East German dictatorship. And this is just a more recent example. And I was looking at that in the 90s, and I thought to myself, I have found these great heroes of resistance in a country where people think there was the Stasi, and then there were the oppressed masses, and there was very little resistance after 1953 when there had been the protest. And I knew from a German filmmaker, a friend who'd made a film about Hans and Sophie Scholl, who were two young students who were resisting Hitler quite late in the piece, in the 40s, by distributing leaflets, anti-Hitler leaflets in a German town, and they were found, tried and executed. They were 19 and 20-year-old siblings. And after the war, now Hans and Sophie Scholl are big heroes in Germany. They're heroes of an anti-Hitler resistance that shows that there were people who were against Hitler, that not everybody was blitzed or pro-Hitler. And people are proud of it. There are plaques on buildings. There are Hans and Sophie Scholl schools named after them, and so on and so forth. And I thought, well, maybe, I mean, in my kind of foolish, naive grandiosity, there are people who were doing that in the second 20th century dictatorship in Germany. And I've found some of them. The stories are exciting and extraordinary, and people will be proud of these stories in Stasiland. And that was not the case in Germany. That was not the case. So what happened was the book was published in many countries, but when it was published in Germany, it was a particularly divided reaction. It wasn't as if West Germans could suddenly say, yes, there are these resistance heroes in East Germany. And a lot of East Germans had been involved with the state or the Stasi or somehow fellow travellers, as you might be. And the sense was much more of shame. If this schoolgirl said, I will not report to the Stasi on my school fellows, and this alcoholic rock star said, I will not betray my rock star comrades, if all of these relatively ordinary people could be so brave, I think the feeling was, well, maybe I should have been. And I didn't mean for that to happen at all. So I found that the book came out in the reception was very sensitive in Germany. And the people obviously most sensitive to it who really hated it, which I wasn't entirely not anticipating, were the Stasi themselves. So I was, for instance, the book was launched in an environment not unlike here at the Leipzig Book Fair, where the front 2 rows of people were ex-Stasi. This is 2004. And I got up to read, and I could tell they were ex-Stasi or ex-party members because they were wearing the uniform of ex-Stasi or ex-party, which was a lot of brill-creamed hair, bomber jackets, and polyester trousers with a really firm crease. And they all sat there looking daggers at me. And when I got up at a lectern like that to read, I was pregnant actually with one of the children who's sitting here. And my knees were knocking, and I got up, and I was reading in German, and I got up, and this is a slight exaggeration, but it seemed to me like all at once, all of them did this action where they reached into their pockets and pulled out notebooks. And then they started taking notes on what I was saying. And I just thought, at that action, I just thought, are you going to seriously intimidate me with the idea that you're making a file on me now? What are you going to do with this thing? And then I was sort of steeled for the reading. And what happened, and I did a 10-city book tour of Germany. This was the first time it happened, but it happened again and again. At the end of my reading, these men, the floor was opened up for questions, as we're about to do in 29 seconds. And the Stasi men pulled their chairs back with great noise and kind of huffed and puffed at me and walked out because they just didn't want to be there for any questions that in their day and under their regime they would never have had to hear. And they stormed out. And then there would be gradually some questions, and somebody invariably stood up at the end and just said, why is it that it takes someone who's not even German, someone from so far away, to come and tell these stories? I was in prison, my son was in prison, whatever it would be. And I thought to myself later, you know what, the reason why it takes an outsider has just left the room. It's because those people were still there and they were still frightening. And much, much later, a story that I won't go into in too much detail, a group of ex-Stasi sued my German publisher and me for things that I'd said about them in the book. They were a group that had been called Das Insider-Komitee, but had changed their name in democracy. They sort of caught on to rebranding. And they changed their name to the Society for the Protection of Civil Liberties and the Dignity of Man, which I always thought was really hysterical. Anyway, they sued me, and in Germany they were successful. So a paragraph from Stasiland, which was about them, was taken out of the book. I've had it put back in the latest edition, but blacked out so that the page looks like a Stasi file. And there's a footnote on that page that just says, this book has been mutilated courtesy of the Society for the Protection of Civil Liberties and the Dignity of Man. Which is just a long way of saying that the reception of both of these books, I think, would be worth a book on its own. It's very interesting how books are received by the people that they're about, you know.
I wouldn't be surprised if there are people in this audience taking notes also, plucking out their
Feel free.
notepads. So I think it's time now for some questions. Please keep them really short so we can have several of them.
Hello? Yeah. Hi, Anna. I visited the Stasi Museum after I read your book and I was spooked. So how do you keep your mental stability when you're researching for something like this?
I couldn't hear that.
How do you keep your mental stability after researching such a book? Because she got spooked when she went to the museum.
Stasi
Oh,
Museum.
I don't think there's very much evidence that I have kept my mental stability. It was a strange time. I was living on my own in a lot of the time that I was researching that book in the 90s. And I think that was a good thing. It was also, it made me feel vulnerable in a way that was nothing like the vulnerability of the people I was writing about. But it put me in a good place of mind, slightly fearful and vulnerable when I was writing about them. I think there are good ways to be open to the world, and sometimes they are at the risk of your mental well-being in a way. I mean, I could have used some of those chocolates, perhaps.
Yeah, there's a question there.
Hi, I'm Prasad. My question is for Norman. There is a slight movement catching up in India about legalizing marijuana, cannabis. What is your opinion on that? Because I personally feel there's a very thin line between legalizing for medical use versus recreational use. What is your opinion about legalizing it for medical use?
Well, I think in general we have to understand drug policies as policies by governments that are often implemented to control people and to sometimes even oppress minorities. So we have to be, I think, very sensitive about drug prohibition. And the marijuana is prohibited, so I think we should look at this case very carefully. Also comparing, for example, marijuana with alcohol, it's clear that marijuana is actually less harmful than alcohol, so it doesn't really make sense to legalize alcohol and to criminalize marijuana. So my personal opinion is actually to legalize marijuana, but I think this is, and I'm just talking for the German society, but this is a very sensitive subject that each society should engage in a conversation with each other to try to figure out what is their relation to drugs. One fact is certain: the war on drugs led by the United States is not working. It is not cutting down on consumption. It is creating dangerous drugs which are not regulated, which are not overseen by any authority. So that for sure is not working. So let's see if we can find other ways to deal with drugs which have been part of the human experience from the start.
Some thought clearly needs to go into the age, because we can vote in India at 18, but can't be served a drink till we are 21. So there is, I think, some debate there as well. Yeah. Please pass the mic around.
Hi. So my question is for both of you. After you published your books, was there any sort of political pressure put upon both of you because your books might invoke some nationalistic sentiments?
Did it outrage nationalistic sentiments? Well, not in your case.
No. Trying to think. No, I'm more a specialist in offending nations. So, as I say, there were many Germans who didn't like the book, and for instance, the press reaction to my book was very favourable from people who had resisted the regime, and if you were a former East German journalist, you hated the book, like the Stasi hated the book. All That I Am is really about the perils of nationalism and people who recognized this terrible scourge that was coming through the 20s with Hitler and his followers. My characters were Jews, but that was they were atheist educated Jews. That was not part of their thinking because the race, I mean, Hitler was obviously anti-Semitic from the start, but he wasn't, the first people that he went after were the journalists and the lawyers and the judges, the people who would speak out against him and the writers. So my interest has been in, I guess, recognizing and combating that kind of mindless, jingoistic, dangerous nationalism, of which there's a lot in many countries now. Yes.
Well, Blitzed deconstructs some of the myths that National Socialism was able to produce and which still lingered on in the present day. So the book would only be attacked maybe by right-wing people, but actually I haven't encountered any attacks from that side. I have encountered a problem with the current German army because they helped me in my research, because one of the stories that we haven't talked about yet was the massive abuse of methamphetamine by the German army. They used millions of dosages of methamphetamine in order to be able to carry out their so-called Blitzkrieg, their speed war, to stay awake also at night and keep going. So when one of my contacts from the current German army read that, he said, well, you're kind of degrading the fighting power of the Wehrmacht. So that was an interesting reaction.
You'll have to be a little quicker with the mic.
No, I just wanted to know, the question is to Norman. Wanted to know the sequence of the last day, in the bunker. The Goebbels died before, or Hitler was the last one who committed suicide? I mean, and Blondie, his German Shepherd dog, who was in the bunker at that time, was she shot or poisoned?
Well, all the people in the bunker had cyanide pills, so they could commit suicide very quickly, and Hitler tried his own pill on his dog Blondie, so Blondie died on cyanide, and then Hitler in a way committed a double suicide. He shot him, he bit the cyanide pill and shot himself, so, after that, the other people, for example, Goebbels also killed himself, so Hitler was the first one to go, with Eva Braun together. His girlfriend.
The half-burnt body of Hitler, was it DNA tested? Or because there's one more theory that he managed to...
Let's just keep one question at a time.
Yeah, a question is for Anna. Yeah, Anna, I was wondering, I assume there's quite a few number of these Stasi still around. So are they politically organized, and if so, do they resonate with the public in any kind of significant manner?
Who is it addressed to?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is the question is, are the Stasi organized and politically active in any way? So in the 90s, the wall fell in at the end of 1989, and the Stasi kind of went to ground. I was told that I would never find any of them to talk to by a woman who was trying to find them to write a thesis. And she had written a polite letter and printed it 147 times and put it in letterboxes in Marzahn, an area where many of them lived. And she got 3 replies, all of which were why they would not be talking to her. And I thought, I don't have the patience for that. So I describe this in the book, actually. I took out an advertisement in the personal columns of the newspaper in Potsdam. I didn't quite realize what I was doing. I had a friend vet my German, but the ad ended up reading, Australian writer seeks Stasi men. View conversation. I think it said discretion guaranteed or something. But the people rang me and they were very nervous. My phone ran absolutely hot. They thought that I was going to be their mouthpiece for the Southern Hemisphere and that they could launch a new left-wing assault from Sydney. One man he said, I will meet you in the middle of the courtyard in Potsdam in front of the church, I will have the Märkische Allgemeine rolled up under my left arm. You know, and he was there dressed as a Westerner. He was in a houndstooth jacket with leather patches on his elbows, you know. So they would sort of disappear. But later, as the years went on into the 2000s, they were quite well funded. A lot of money disappeared from East German state coffers. And they founded a political party. And that political party has now folded, but amalgamated into another left-wing party, which is getting quite a lot of seats. So you have now this tussle of left and right in the former East German states. And I think the thing to remember about the former East is that it was never denazified, because when the Russians occupied the Eastern Zone, overnight, those Germans had to say, were made to feel, I don't know which is which, we socialists, as we all are now, like yesterday we were Nazis, today we're socialists because we're occupied by the Russians. They are our brothers. They liberated us from the Nazis, and all the Nazis were in the West, or we kicked them all out. Whereas in West Germany, there was 40 years of education and research and remorse and investigation of what happened. In the East, there was nothing. So the taboos against Hitler and, for instance, the swastika are much, much weaker. So you see both a right-wing movement and this former East German party kind of revanche.
Last question, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah. This is one to Anna and one to Norman. Anna, a big fan of your book. One question that I have is, Stasiland showed a version of surveillance which was people to people. Now the idea of surveillance is changing, where now it's more intense and it's technologically driven. So how do you see this affecting the governance or the insecurity or the fear of people now as surveillance changes? And Norman, the nature of drugs are also changing in combat. The ISIS has been using Captagon, which is a fearless drug. So how do you see drugs being used in warfare now? So one question each.
Anna, go ahead.
Look, I think the world has changed so radically. It's almost like a Stasi fantasy. I think personal privacy is over, you know, and that's something that frightens me, and we haven't yet delimited personal privacy, and we don't yet know the effects of what we've given up. You know, we all gave up all our personal information for free to Google, Facebook, Twitter, and everyone else to make money out of. We sold ourselves without getting anything back, and the cost of that we haven't yet paid. So there are lots of wonderful benefits to this technology, but the cost of it, as I say, we don't know yet. It's a big discussion. I'm writing about it at the moment, but I think we should go to Norman.
Well, to answer your question, the Nazis were basically the first regime to drug their soldiers with methamphetamine in that case. The British learned from the Nazis, the Americans learned from the British, and these days terrorists also learn that amphetamines can be used to turn human beings into entities that are able to go into a room and kill other people, which is very unusual behavior. So we can see that how the story that I wrote down in Blitzed kind of evolved and still creates immense problems today.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Anna. I personally enjoyed reading both your books.
Hi, excuse me. I have one question.
Wishing more power to your pen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are we going to be signing?